Hey, students, this is part two of the events leading to the American Revolution lecture here. And so, basically, up to this previous point, we've already covered Module 1. And Module 1 covered basic chapters 1 through 4, the colonial history up until, or I guess I should say, through the 7 Years' War or French Indian War. And so, we ended the first part talking about the Boston Massacre and the increased deployment of British troops and so forth. So if you remember from the first part that Britain was in debt with mercantilism, gold and silver in your treasury equals power. Colonies are there to benefit the mother country, and you always want to sell more than what you're buying. So from between 1771 and 1776, things got much more heated to the point within about 5 years, the colonists are going to be fighting in a revolution starting in 1775. So we've talked about in part one about the committees of correspondence. And this spread throughout all 13 colonies. Doesn't mean everybody in the colonies participated by any means. It was definitely a minority movement. But what these committees of correspondence did is they sent out propaganda documents that kind of explained what these tax officials were doing, what the British government was doing. A lot of it is propaganda, exaggerating the truth and so forth to make it seem worse than what it actually was. Some of it actually was true. It just kind of depended on the what documents were passed around and so forth. So what was their purpose? Basically to spread information. It's kind of like the 1770s version of Twitter and the news media and so forth. So as I stated in part one, colonists, what they typically did for enjoyment or leisure, if they were literate, then they read. They read newspapers, they read books, and so forth. They read about what was happening back in England because they were proud to be British, and so forth. Of course, they participated in other leisure activities from horse racing to different games, spending time in taverns. That was kind of like the 1770s version of a present-day coffee shop. And so they definitely spent time socializing and so forth. And so at these taverns and so forth, that's where a lot of this committees of correspondence were able to spread their colonial documents. So if you've lived in the United States for any period of time, you've heard about the Boston Tea Party. And so not to be confused with the Tea Party movement that began in the 2000s, but basically what had happened was the Townshend Acts had put a tax on paint, paper, lead, and tea. And whenever the British Parliament repealed the Townshend Acts, they left the tax on tea. Now, basically, one of the things that they had done is by leaving this tax on tea, it was the most consumed liquid in the colonies, more so than even alcohol was. But tea was a very much consumed liquid, and primarily they got tea from Asia, and because of the global commerce that was emerging in the period of exploration and colonization, and so forth for these Western European powers, tea was widely and readily available. And so there was this joint stock company called the British East India Company. And basically what they had done is, for the British Crown, had won in a big battle in present-day Bengal part of northeastern India against the French during the 7 Years' War. And so their company was in debt. And the British Parliament, to reward them for helping them beat the French in the 7 Years' War, they decided to make it where they would keep the tax on tea on every other tea company except for the British East India Company. So basically, they got a tax-free product to sell to the colonists. And so what it was designed to do is to kind of bail them out and help them gain revenue from tea sales to kind of pay back their debts and so forth they'd owed for helping the British win against the French in the 7 Years' War. And so actually the American colonists were, through the British East India Company, were given cheaper tea. Problem is that a lot of the members of the Sons of Liberty felt like that the Britain is telling them who they should buy tea from, and it angered them. And so one night in the 1770s, they basically decided to dress up like Mohawk Indians in December of 1773. So it's the middle of the winter. And they boarded some of the ships of the British East India Company, docked at Boston Harbor, and they dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. And so now I know tea is rather light, but the way that they were carried, it was the equivalent in terms of weight of about 19 Chevrolet Suburbans. Chevrolet Suburbans or GMC Yukon XL. Those are heavy vehicles. And so you're dumping the equivalent of weight of 19 of those into the Boston Harbor. And so obviously that's a big no-no. And obviously there was not Mohawk Indians. They lived in Western New York or upstate New York. And so people knew that it was actually not Mohawk Indians by any means. And they dumped it into the Boston Harbor. And so how Britain responds to this is what's going to forever change the course of American history. Had they responded differently, who knows? Tensions might have been assuaged, but instead, what ends up happening is Parliament is fed up with these rowdy colonials, and they decide that the best course of action is to actually punish them severely. And so what they ended up doing is they decided to shut down Boston Harbor entirely. So the Sons of Liberty obviously make up a minority of the population in Boston. Doesn't mean everybody in Boston was like this. And so they completely shut down the Boston Harbor. And so they eliminated the vast majority of people's in Boston and around the Boston area, their ability to make a living. And so in world history, when I teach world history, I always tell students that if you want to get people upset and get revolution to happen, you affect their ability to be able to put food on the table for themselves and their families. That's when you see a lot of revolutions happen. Is not in good economic times, but it's almost always in bad economic times. And so basically they shut down Boston Harbor until all the payment of that tea that had been destroyed, the 342 chests of tea that they had dumped, until it's paid back, then they had shut it down. And so what ends up happening is the other 12 colonies were like, whoa, if Britain Parliament is going to have the authority to do that, could they shut down Charleston Harbor? Could they shut down Jamestown? Could they shut down Philadelphia? And so it in some ways kind of united the American colonists against the British. But one thing you got to understand too, that even throughout the war, if you want to kind of make it in terms of fractions, you have a little more than a third of the American colonists that supported the American Revolution. So a little more than a third that's patriots. You had a little less than a third who were loyalists, and a little less than a third probably that were neutral, just kind of stuck in the middle. And so the whole American Revolution is actually fought as a minority movement. Now, granted, it was the largest of the three groups, but still less than 50% of the population. And so one of the things that ends up happening is this official policy that Britain has that they refer to as the Coercive Acts, trying to coerce the Bostonians to get in line with British imperial policy. The American colonists famously called it the Intolerable Acts. And so they instituted martial law as well. So not just shutting down Boston Harbor, but also putting out martial law. They put a curfew on colonists, prevented them from meeting, and had shut down different representative government in the colony of Massachusetts. And so what ends up happening, if you look here at this graph, with the Coercive Acts, it shuts down commerce completely. And so how are they supposed to pay back this debt if they can't even make a living and sell stuff? And so it was designed to get them in shape, ends up being disastrous. Okay. So at that point, that's when colonists from across the 13 colonies decided that they were going to meet in Philadelphia to form a Congress to respond to this Intolerable Act. So there is two Continental Congresses. The first one meets in 1774. The second one meets in 1775 and continues until the United States is granted independence officially in 1783. So their main goal is to try to negotiate with King George in Parliament. Now, one thing to take note of that's pretty interesting at this time is that the colonists felt like up until about 1775, that King George was not to blame. It was Parliament's to blame. And so they put most of their complaints towards Parliament and very much revered King George. After during 1775 and afterwards, then they start blaming King George, and then they kind of suck up to Parliament. I'll explain why that is here in a minute. So you have a couple different factions within the Continental Congress. You have kind of the radicals and more of the moderates. And so what the things that they agreed to send was this document called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. So basically, like, here's our rights, here's our complaints that we have against you guys. And they decided that they were going to try to have peace, wanted to stay within the British Empire still. And so they had decided, well, what if we boycott British goods? It had worked in repealing the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. That was actually proposed by John Adams. They decided to go with that. At this point, Parliament is fed up, and so is the king, and it didn't work. And they also told their militias to drill, try to get a stockpile of musket balls and gunpowder, and start drilling in preparation in case things go south with the British. And obviously they do. So at this First Continental Congress, famous American patriot by the name of Patrick Henry makes his very much well-known speech, where at the end of it, he basically says, I know not what other course or what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And so if I was in class with you, we'd actually read his speech in greater detail and discuss it. But for time's sake, with this being a remote class, we're not going to do that. And so right here, his famous quote, give me liberty or give me death. There's just a famous excerpt from it. You can go online and read more of it if you'd like. So they agreed to boycott British goods. John Adams proposed that. Much more rural colonists began getting involved by 1774, where before it was primarily in the cities. And so particularly one of the reasons why rural colonists were getting frustrated is they wanted to move west. Gold and silver was short supply. They wanted to be able to use paper currency to be able to buy land. Land was still relatively cheap. And so kind of the one story throughout American history is go west to availability of cheaper land as land fills up and so forth in these original 13 colonies. And colonists are starting to want to move west of the Appalachians. But if you remember, the Proclamation Line of 1763 prevented that. And the Currency Act that Britain had passed at the end of the 7 Years' War prevented them from producing their own currency as well. So that gets more rural colonists involved. And that's significant because without the rural colonists involved, because the vast majority of the 13 colonies is rural, there's no way the colonies would ever won the American Revolution. So many that stayed loyal, yes, they were frustrated with Parliament and King George, but they feared that you would have mob rule and anarchy locally if they ended up breaking away from England. And so they said, well, I'd rather have 1,000 or a tyrant 10,000 miles away than have 10,000 tyrants 1 mile away. And so many American colonists supported royal governors. They may not have been happy, but they were still loyal to the British Crown. So which groups tended to remain neutral? You end up having the Quakers in Pennsylvania, which makes sense. You remember from Module 1, they don't believe in war. They were pacifists. And a lot of the Germans, they just felt like it wasn't, hey, we're happy to be here. We're happy to live on our land. This is not worth getting upset over. So they tried to remain neutral. You also began having what's called the Regulator Movement in North Carolina and farmers in Eastern Maryland that remained loyal. If we remember, we covered the Regulator Movement in your textbook in Module 1. And then royal officials, well, they're getting paid by the British government. Yes, they're going to remain loyal primarily. There was one colonial governor in Connecticut who was actually a close friend of George Washington, who was the only colonial governor who supported the American Revolution, who was a governor before the American Revolution. So kind of an interesting individual. Anglican clergy, so these are people that were the ministers of the Church of England. They're going to remain loyal. And well-established lawyers that weren't like in the New England area, some of them are going to remain loyal, but some of the lawyers are also going to be patriots as well. So if you look at British troop deployment, so 1763, the map on the left, Most of the troops are in New York or they're on frontier forts because of Pontiac's War at the end of the 7 Years' War. But then you look at 1770, yes, they're still concentrated along the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River Valley, but notice that much more troops are now concentrated in New York, Philadelphia, and in between, and then also particularly Boston. And so you also see that they are not as concentrated in the frontier as much. Now they're concentrated in the eastern cities as well. And you look at 1775, wow, they have moved the majority of their troops by far to Boston because of the rowdy Bostonians. So let's explain the first battle of the American Revolution. It is Lexington and Concord, the famous shot heard around the world. And so a lot of people have heard of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Actually, I was going to kind of interesting story. Paul Revere actually gets captured. The reason why Paul Revere is famous in American history is because of there's a famous Washington Irving poem in 1820 called The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere because his name sounded better with his title, but really it should be The Midnight Ride of William Dawes. Paul Revere gets captured about halfway to Lexington and Concord. It's William Dawes who makes it all the way and alerts the colonial militia, or the Minutemen. They were supposed to be ready at a minute's notice that the British were coming. So what it found out is John Hancock, one of the famous American patriots, the wealthiest guy in Boston. He had made a lot of his living smuggling and paying off customs officials before the 7 Years' War, during the 7 Years' War. But by the 1770s, he has upset the British. They have seized his house, and he has fled and become a patriot, much like Sam Adams and others. And he had been hiding out in Lexington and Concord. The British soldiers got word that John Hancock and Sam Adams were out away from Boston, the Lexington Concord area, and that the colonial militias had been gathering supplies and ammunition and so forth. So they went out there to go capture it. So William Dawes alerted the American Minutemen, and they faced off against the British at the town of Lexington. Now, what's interesting about the Battle of Lexington, nobody knows in history who fired the first shot. There's competing theories. Some competing theories say the British did it. Some say the Americans did it. Some say that somebody fired from a nearby house. Somebody fired a shot in the air. Who knows? That's one thing about history we will never probably end up knowing. But somebody fired a first shot. Both sides fired at each other, and you had some people fall dead, and the Americans fled. Now, as they're fleeing towards Concord, they end up were being reinforced as more and more rural Massachusetts men from the countryside began to emerge. And what ends up happening is they end up fighting the British pretty well and end up kind of using hit and run tactics that they had learned from fighting against the Native Americans during the 7 Years' War, the French Indian War, and were able to stop the British, and the British end up retreating. Now, it's during the retreat where the British suffered most of their casualties because the Americans used hit and run tactics from the woods all the way, not all the way back to Boston, but at least halfway back to Boston. So you had about 5,000 American patriots that fought against the British, and the Americans ended up having about 90 dead or wounded or captured by the British, while the British suffered about 250 dead, wounded, or captured. So here you are fighting against one of the greatest militaries in the world, certainly the best Navy in the world. Their army was nothing to be ashamed of, and the Americans' first battle against them, they whipped them. That is not always going to be the case. In fact, usually the British end up winning more battles than they lost against the Patriots in the American Revolution. But in this particular battle, the Americans won. So if you remember in the First Continental Congress, they met in 1774, and they had decided that if things did get better in the next year, in 1775, they'd reconvene. Well, Lexington and Concord happened. Obviously, things are not doing better, and so they end up convening again in Philadelphia. And at this point, they make a couple of very important decisions. One is they decide to appoint George Washington, the wealthiest colonial at that time in the original 13 colonies. They appoint him as the commander of the Continental Army. Now, there was some founding fathers who disagreed with that. Benjamin Rush was one of them, actually a close friend of John Adams, but John Adams actually favored appointing George Washington. The reason why they appointed him, the main reason is because he was from Virginia. Massachusetts realized that, hey, if we're going to win against the British, we're going to have the largest and most populated colony of Virginia support us. So that was strategic. Secondly, he was the one that had the most military experience, having fought as a colonel in the colonial militia on behalf of Virginia during the 7 Years' War. In fact, the French Indian War started because of George Washington, his decision near Fort Duquesne. So anyway, they decided that. And then they also decided they were going to try one last peace offering. It's called the Olive Branch Petition. Olive branch is at that time, a universal symbol for peace. And so they sent one last plea to King George, hoping they can assuage Parliament to end up listening to their grievances, provide representation in Parliament for the original 13 colonies, and so forth. King George III doesn't even read it. So he is so angered about what had happened at Lexington and Concord, he ended up not even opening the letter. So obviously things did not improve. John Hancock is the head of the Continental Congress at that time, and George Washington is now the head of the Patriot Militia, or what ends up becoming the Continental Army. So what ends up happening is George Washington quickly travels up to outside of Boston. The colonial militia, or now the Continental Army, surrounds Boston. The thing about Boston, it's obviously grown significantly since then, but at this time, Boston Harbor was at a low-lying area right there on the coast, and the Continental Army seized the heights above the city, so they kind of had the high ground. And so George Washington definitely did not have a professional army. They lacked resources. Men weren't paid, so basically they're fighting for free. And the Continental Army doesn't have any money to supply them. So that could be a recipe for disaster. But so the British decide that, being arrogant at the time, that they were going to attack the Americans right where Charlestown is today. It's a part of Boston. And so it's called the Battle of Bunker Hill, but actually it was fought on Breed's Hill. Bunker Hill was just a little bit to the northwest of it. And so the Americans kind of dug in. Here they are. They're not trained professional soldiers by any means, and so as the British are arrogant, think they can dislodge the Americans from this hill, which they eventually do, but at a huge cost. They end up attacking 3 different charges up this hill against the Americans, and so the American commander at Breed's Hill told his troops to wait and fire until you see the whites of their eyes. So the Americans, when the British charged, they mowed them down. And so the British suffered 40% casualties against this ragtag bunch of men. It's because the Patriots had the strategic advantage. The only reason why the Americans retreated is because they ran out of ammunition. And so, in fact, the last charge, when the Patriots ran out of ammunition, they were chucking rocks at them, which if that doesn't get your patriotic blood flowing, I don't know what will. So you end up having, even though the Americans lose the hill, it's a moral victory. And at that point, King George decides, you know what? I don't want to lose a bunch of my troops, and so it's better just to spend money. So he ends up hiring 10,000 Hessian soldiers to help put down the rebellion. And basically, the Hessians are these hired German mercenaries, so to speak. And in fact, when many colonials find out that the king had done this, that actually put them over the edge and ended up supporting the Patriot cause, because they're angry, like, how dare King George send over these German foreigners to help to fight against us, and so forth. So there's some famous paintings of the Battle of Bunker Hill. It really should be called the Battle of Breed's Hill. So at this point, the Continental Congress decided, you know what, we need to declare independence, really because of John Adams and some of the other Massachusetts men, but they convinced Virginia, the largest, most populated colony, to go for independence as well. They also convinced people like Ben Franklin and others. It took a while to convince them to actually declare independence, because they don't actually agree to independence until the summer of 1776. So when the Olive Branch Petition fails, they have been blaming Parliament up to this point. Now they're going to change and do a 180. They're going to actually blame the king. If you read the Declaration of Independence, it actually, most of the grievances are aimed at the king, and they try to suck up to Parliament. So why in the world would they blame Parliament for the longest time and now do a 180 and try to suck up to them? Well, there was a couple of different political parties in Parliament at that time, and there was a group of moderates called the Whigs, which was also another name for patriots. That was another nickname for patriots during the American Revolution. And later it's going to become a political party in the 1830s until the 1850s, when they die out. but they were an influential political party in American history, but that's where the name comes from. And so they were trying to appeal to the moderates in Parliament that maybe the Whigs in Parliament will grant us independence. They knew that if they had a chance, it would be with the Whigs, not the other party. And so the king sent the proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition in August of 1775. So not the response they were hoping for. And then in 1776, the United States decides that they need to declare independence. So the American colonials had actually sent letters to the British colonies in the Caribbean, such as Jamaica and Barbados and others, to see if they would want to meet with them and potentially declare independence. They also were hoping that the French, who had lost in the 7 Years' War up in Canada, would be interested in rebelling with them. That might have been the case had things not happened right before this. The British Parliament had granted them religious freedom and their own colonial assembly, and so the French citizens of Canada didn't really have a reason to complain at this time. So what ends up happening is the Continental Army ends up sending a faction, actually led by none other than Benedict Arnold and another commander, to try to invade and Canada and try to get them to break away with them. It ends up failing. And actually, the United States invades Canada 4 different times in American history, once during the American Revolution, and then 3 times during the War of 1812. All 4 are failures. One was partly successful in the War of 1812, but the rest were complete failures. What ends up happening that causes the invasion of Quebec and Canada particularly to fail is smallpox breaks out in the American military ranks. And smallpox has been one of the biggest disease killers of world history. You could argue smallpox or tuberculosis probably is the biggest killer of world history, even more so than the Black Death and so forth, just because overall numbers throughout history. They are going to practice inoculation during the American Revolution, and that's kind of like a primitive form of immunization, but that doesn't come until later in the war when George Washington makes that decision to do that. So anyway, Benedict Arnold was successful at Montreal, but they failed to take Quebec, which was really the capital of Canada at that time, due to the smallpox outbreak. Basically, they boycott British goods again. We cut off all exports to Britain, and Parliament passed a prohibitory act that basically not only did they shut off Boston Harbor, now they're cutting off all trade entirely with the 13 colonies. So if you were a loyalist who had supported the British government, now your ability to make a living for your family is also affected as well, particularly if you're a loyal British merchant in, say, Savannah, Georgia, or somewhere. So you end up having rebellion break out in the South as well. The governor of Virginia flees, but he did raise 2 loyalist militia. And so part of the thing you're going to see in the American Revolution is not just fighting between the Continental Army and the British Army. You're also going to have fighting between colonial militias or patriot militias and loyalist militias who weren't in uniform, and you end up having them fight in several battles, particularly in the southern colonies as well. And so one of the battles that takes place between loyalist and patriot militias is actually at the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge that took place. Now, what ends up happening that's tremendously significant, it was in January of 1776. This is actually probably the most influential colonial propaganda document outside the Declaration of Independence, is Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Now, Thomas Paine was an English immigrant to the American colonies. He hadn't lived there but maybe 3 or 4 years, and it was written at a very simple level. He wrote it what today would be considered a 3rd grade educational level, so the average American who was literate could actually read it. And in this pamphlet, it was actually the second most produced piece of literature outside of the first was being the Bible at that time in the colonies, was Common Sense, and basically argued that yes, it is common sense now that we need to break away from England. And so if we were in class face to face, we would be looking at some of his speech, and he lays out a very simple but persuasive message, and it convinces a lot of colonists to actually break away from Britain. And so here's, if you want to read this will some of his arguments. It's kind of a fascinating writing. But one of his famous lines, it's time to part. It's time to part with the British government. And basically arguing just like a teenager leaves the house, it's time that the American colonies are like a teenager. It's time to leave the house and leave British rule. And so what's interesting about that is it does convince a lot of people. If it wasn't for Common Sense being published by Thomas Paine, then basically what you'd end up having is the Declaration of Independence would not have been written and signed in the summer of 1776. So it actually influenced the Declaration of Independence. Let's look at the original Thomas Jefferson, OTJ, the guy who famously wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was a wealthy plantation owner from Virginia. Somebody throughout his life will be conflicted over the issue of slavery. He knew it was morally wrong, yet his extravagant life was as a result of it. He was a Renaissance man. He's probably one of the most educated men of the first half of American history. Probably wrote more than any other American president. He wrote all the time. He was not a very powerful or persuasive speaker, but man, he was a talented writer. And he was a representative to the Second Continental Congress. And so what he does, John Adams and a guy named John Jay and Ben Franklin encouraged Jefferson to write it. They wanted to be somebody from the largest colony of Virginia. They knew that Jefferson was a very talented writer. In fact, John Adams persuaded him specifically to write it, and they actually became good friends. And so in this document, the famous part of the document is the first two paragraphs, where we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among those of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It is an Enlightenment document. So if you remember from the first module, the Enlightenment was this, for the first time, really had challenged the status quo of monarch's rule of government, is that power comes from the consent of the governed, not just the, power doesn't come just from God. And some of the Enlightenment, quite a few of the Enlightenment thinkers did believe in God, but they thought that no, God has given us these rights. Jefferson, being a deist, he wasn't a Christian, but he believed that God created the heavens and the earth, but is not involved in your personal lives, kind of set it to work like a clock, where you could step back and kind of just observe. And so he said that God gave us these rights as people, and that if the government's not providing them, then we have the right to overthrow them. And so it basically lists 27 grievances. So it's basically like, you suck because of blah, blah, blah. You suck because of this. You suck because of that. And it's basically like a list of like, hey, here's why we're breaking up and we're never getting back together, ever. So it is a formal declaration of war as well. And at that point, even though Britain didn't recognize us and some other nations around the world did not recognize, we became the United States of America. And so Jefferson, though, his original writing of the Declaration of Independence, will never actually know what it said. It was edited by Franklin and John Adams. It's debated about some of the things that he had said. I know that it had offended him, their edits, because he wrote that I'll never write anything that can be edited again because of some of the things. And who knows? I mean, he said that all men are created equal. Who knows? Maybe he said all men and women, or if he mentioned something about slavery, who knows? We'll never actually know what the original rendition of the Declaration of Independence actually said. And so he basically plagiarized from John Locke, his treatise on government, which Jefferson had widely read and loved. And so instead of saying life, liberty, and pursuit of property, which was what Locke said, he said life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which owning property is going to be a big thing in American history. But maybe they decided that they wanted people to say you can pursue happiness. Just because you don't own property doesn't mean that you aren't happy. So you can kind of read over this. One of the big things is all men are created equal. That's going to be something that's not realized for a while in American history, as you're going to see that not until the 15th Amendment that African-American men are given the right to vote. It's not until 1924 that Native Americans are given the right to vote. It's not until 1920 that women are given the right to vote. And it's not until the early 1970s that 18 to 21-year-olds are given the right to vote during the Vietnam War. So why the Second Continental Congress finally declared independence? Well, they hoped to secure an alliance with Spain. That failed. Spain never joined with them, which is going to be kind of an interesting what ends up happening with the Treaty of Paris 1783. The Spanish were allied with France, but not the United States. And so that's going to complicate some things with the peace process. Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, it persuaded a lot of people, including some of the members of the Continental Congress. Also, frustration and being ticked off that King George III would hire Germans help them. So this concludes the second part of the events leading to the American Revolution. Or the next one will cover the actual American Revolution itself.